while they're headed down, grab your copy of the scriptures, and we'll be looking at the book of Easter. I did that this morning. I've got Easter on the mind. Esther. Easter. While they're heading out, while you're turning to the book of Esther, Easter. And while you're turning there, I'll say good morning and greetings to all who are watching online or welcome to Bible Baptist Church online service. We're glad you could be a part of this and study the scriptures together with us. We just recently celebrated this past week the Jewish holiday Purim. And as I shared with you last week, Purim is a holiday where Thursday was a day of fasting, and Friday and Saturday were a day of feasting and celebrating. I was sharing with some of you this past week that Purim is kind of like a mixture of holidays. It's kind of like Halloween and Christmas combined for those celebrating in the Jewish tradition. There's dressing up and acting out the story in the book of Esther, and then there's a lot of food and celebration and gift giving, as is described in the book of Esther, chapter 9. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a little bit, but last week we read through Esther's story in the book of Esther, and because of the time constraint last week, we just kind of read through it, and I shared with you a little bit of the details. This week I want to go in a little bit deeper into some of the story, and give you a little bit more information, a little bit more history, and a little bit more of the study of the book of Esther. And as I was looking at the book of Esther in the past several weeks, last week trying to decide, okay, how can we do this? Even today, I was thinking there's just got to be a couple things that I can pull out of this because the book of Esther, even though it's only 9.5, 10 chapters long, there's so much that can be pulled out of it. But today I just want to share with you just a couple of the stories and stuff, some of the examples that we see in the book of Esther. For the sake of time, I'm not going to review the book of Esther. If you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to read it. The book of Esther, it's only, again, 9.5 chapters. It's 10 chapters, but the 10th chapter is very short. Or watch the Veggie Tales Esther. We did not get it. Don't watch that. No, you could. There's versions where people act it out, or cartoon versions of the story of Esther, because it's a story that's been told over and over. But just a quick reminder: Esther's a Jewish girl that was raised by her cousin Mordecai. They were living in Persia under King Xerxes. This was about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. And so there's still descendants of Jews living in this area. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that, but before we do that, we're going to dig in. I have three different dig-in points that I wanted to share with you, if time allows. The first two are a little bit longer than the third, but that's okay. We're going to get through this. We're going to dig into the Esther story. I had several folks tell me last week, after we read through the Esther story, that they had forgotten some of those details and some of the illustrations that we have. And so, like I said, I want to get into some of the meat, to dig in a little bit deeper into the story. And some of that is in Esther chapter 2, and this is a tough part of the story, because Esther's story, we sometimes think of these biblical stories, these biblical examples, think that everything was just perfect and rosy, and God made everything right and perfect for these biblical characters. And that's not what we see in Esther's story. For example, in Esther chapter 2, I'm going to start reading at verse 5. These are some of the things that we know about Esther. Esther chapter 2, verse 5. There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. He was the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So there was a man still living in Susa. He was a Jew. His name was Mordecai. His great-great-grandpa was one of those taken away as a captive back when Nebuchadnezzar stormed Jerusalem and razed and tore down the city, burned the temple, and took captives. So what we see right here in the first two verses of Esther chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, we see a little bit of information about Esther. She's with the captives. She's living with people their people have been captives here in the Persian Empire. They're exiled Jews. These people have lost their family, they've lost their home, they've lost their national honor. She's living with those who were captives from a couple generations before her. The Jews in the Persian Empire at this time were the lower class. They were the servants. They were the captives. This is part of Esther's story. Why I'm telling you this, you'll see in just a moment. Goes on, verse 7, Mordecai was bringing up Hadassah, which is Esther's name in Hebrew. Esther is Persian. It means star. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Esther the star in just a moment. But Mordecai was bringing up Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure, was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So what do we see here with Esther's story? We see that she has no parents, right? She's being brought up by this older cousin, Mordecai. She is not only living outside of her home country, she's living with the exiles, but she has no home family. She's being raised by an older cousin. Verse 8, when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. The young woman, Esther, pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with the cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to be the best in the harem. This is part of that story that sometimes the story of Esther gets skipped over because you're like, wait, okay, so King Xerxes had his wife Vashti kicked out of the palace, and then he does this beauty pageant to see who wants to be the next queen, and he has all these women come in, and here's Esther, she's put into this, and for her to be trained to be the next queen, she's living with these other women who are brought in there and under the charge of this other man in the palace, and they're just being trained to please the king. They're being trained to be the next queen and or please, they're part of a harem. This is not really a pretty picture for Esther. You know, it's one of those parts of the story we kind of skip past it. But we see that Esther's not living, you know, a perfect rosy life. This lets us know that she's in custody. She's under the watchful eye of the king's servant, and she's, again, being trained to please the king. Verse 10 tells us a little bit more about Esther. Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. She didn't tell anyone that she was Jewish. Her cousin Mordecai said, don't tell anyone you're Jewish, try and just blend in with the crowd. And so her name was changed from a Hebrew name to a Persian name Sitara, or Esatar, which is Persian for where we get Esther, Esatar. And we were talking about this a little bit last week, how sometimes a name has that added to it. I think Spanish does that, right? Esatar or Sitara, but it's Esther, where we get Esther. And in Persian it means star. It's kind of an interesting picture in this, and we'll get to it in just a little bit, but star, Esatar, Esther, didn't let anyone know that she was Jewish. She couldn't tell anybody of her nationality. So here she is in a bad situation, and she couldn't even tell people about her own family. To make things worse, look at verse 12. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Xerxes, verse 13 says, when the young woman Esther went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of another servant, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the king's concubines. So Esther would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. I don't think I need to go into explaining what this part of the passage is talking about, but needless to say, Esther is not in control of her life. She is being told where to go, what to do, how to do it. Her whole life is being dictated to her as she's passed from one of the king's servants to the other with harems and concubines and not really a pretty situation. Esther was living in a difficult time and place in history. And her story is sometimes tough because we want to skip to the end and see where everything's great. But Esther chapter 2 tells us that things are not great for Esther. Just a quick summary. She's living with the exiled Jews. She lost her family home. She lost her national honor. She's living among the captives, the lower class, the servants, the captives. She has no family environment, no parents. She's being raised by an older cousin. She's lost her freedom. She's in custody of the king's servants. She's being trained to please the king, and she's in custody. She's always being passed from one king's servant to the other and being told where to be, what to do, how to do it, etc. Esther's part of the story, Esther chapter 2 here, is a dark time in history. She's in a tough place. She's got a rough life. And she's in a crooked and twisted story. But remember Esther's name. What does it mean in Persian? Star. Christians, Paul tells us, are supposed to live like Esther, like Esther, and be like stars. Listen to what Paul tells us in Philippians. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you will shine like stars in the sky. This is what Paul tells Christians to do. Be like Esther. Be a star in a dark world. Esther experienced that. She was in a crooked and twisted storyline. A really dark time and place in history. But she was named Star, and she shined like a star, and she changed the history of the Jewish people by being different. You read through her story, and it says every time she came into somebody's presence, she earned their favor. People looked at Esther and went, there's something different about you. She earned the favor of the servants that were overseeing her, the favor of the king. Everybody she came in their presence, they went, there's something special about Esther. She shined like a star in a twisted and corrupt and crooked generation. In church, I think we need to be reminded the same thing. We might live in a dark, uncertain time just like Esther, but we're supposed to shine like stars. We're supposed to be different than everybody else. And we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. Esther's story is kind of interesting in that growing up in captivity, being dispersed, the Jews were dispersed all throughout Persia, and Jews were spread out all over Asia, Africa, even parts of Europe. One historian, Josephus, said that wherever the Jews went, the Jews told others about their religion and their God. And an important part of the Jewish faith is to believe and expect the appearance of the deliverer, the promised Messiah. Wherever the Jews went, whenever they were spread out all over the world, they would spread this faith and the expectation. And interestingly enough, a couple years after Esther shined like a star in her dark world, Magi from the east heard about another star, and they went following it and looked for the Messiah in Jerusalem. That's because Esther was shining like a star in her crooked and twisted generation. And those Magi, a couple hundred years later, were looking for hope too, and they were following this star, Esther, when it rose in the east and over Jerusalem. But we're going to come back to Esther shining like a star, and us shining like stars in a little bit, because I want to get to point 2 real quick, digging in a little deeper into the Esther story, because I have to very quickly and bluntly point something out. In the whole book, in the whole story of Esther, God's not mentioned one time. Did anybody else notice it? We read through the whole Esther story last week. It's a book of the Bible, and God is not mentioned one time. Isn't that interesting? I found that interesting. God's not meant, this whole book is to point us to God. And there's a book in here, a compilation of books. There's one in here called the Book of Esther, a history account of a young lady named Esther, and God is not mentioned in it. Reread the book of Esther. See it for yourself. You'll see it. God's name is mentioned in there. There's some very interesting things in there that point to God. There's some very specific things that make it look like, okay, God's part of this story. It's just that he's not mentioned. And one of the commentators I was reading noted and commented this way. He said, as though God were behind the scenes coordinating coincidences and circumstances to make his will happen. If you read through the book of Esther, you'll see that God's not mentioned, but that circumstances and coincidences just happen, like God is moving pieces around on a chessboard. God's in control, he's behind the scenes, being a part of the story, just not proclaimed in the story. For example, there's different, all throughout the story of Esther, Esther's part of a corrupt custom of gathering young ladies for the sadistic, selfish Persian king Xerxes. Out of all the others, Esther caught his attention. Seems kind of a random fact, but it's something special going on there. She was special. She earned the favor of the king and all who were around her. She stood out from everybody else. Mordecai's statement of the Jews being saved, for example. If you're in Esther, turn to Esther chapter 4, verse 14. You'll see an interesting statement where it looks like something was taken out of it. Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Mordecai is talking to Esther, and he's talking about how the Jews are being oppressed and that they would be killed and destroyed. Mordecai says to Esther, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Mordecai has a hope that the Jews would be delivered and rescued. What is his hope in? Well, it's almost like part of that verse was taken out. It's like Mordecai said something, if you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. It's almost as if he said, God would provide another deliverer if it's not you. But the word God is not in there. You can read that verse and see that he is implying that he has a faith in God. It's just that God's not mentioned. Another example, Esther was telling Mordecai and the rest of the Jewish nation to fast. You might remember this from last week when we read through this story. Esther said, for 3 days, fast, and then I will go and approach the king and ask for mercy. Ask for his help. But what is the point of fasting? Usually the phrase is, you fast and pray. But the word and pray is not in there. It's just fast. It's implied that they were fasting and praying. It's just that it says just fast. Esther said fast for 3 days, but it's implied. Fast and pray to God for his deliverance, for his help in this situation. But it's not in there. The whole book of Esther, you see that God is implied as being a part of the story. He's just not mentioned. It's kind of an interesting twist in this. But there's also, throughout the whole story of Esther, a bunch of coincidences or things that just happen to happen or randomly happen, where we know the rest of the story, it's not just randomly happening. What? The whole point of the way that the story is told is that something miraculous was happening to redirect and move the pieces into the right place and for things to happen at the right time. So it's deliberate. The story is deliberately showing God's working without mentioning God in the story. Think of all the different just happened to happen stories. You have Mordecai just happens to be standing outside the gate when there's an assassination attempt being discussed, and Mordecai just happens to hear it, and he just goes in, tells Esther, who tells the king, and the king says, oh, there's an assassination attempt, you guys are out of here. And then the king just happens to have it written down in his diary. Mordecai saved my life today. It just happens that as Haman saw Mordecai, evil Haman, he saw that a Jewish man wasn't respecting him. It's kind of interesting that Haman was a descendant of a king. and a whole family line that hated the Jews. And it just happened to be that he was promoted into a position where he oversaw Mordecai and the Jews. And it seems like there's no apparent reason, but all these things just kind of fall into place. There's another random event of evil Haman building a gallows to hang Mordecai on it, and somebody else seeing that, and it's turning around the whole events. There's the just random chance of Haman going and casting lots. Casting lots is kind of a way of saying tossing the dice to make a decision. I've got to tell you a really weird story here for a second. You ever play dice games? We usually use a 6-sided dice when we're playing a dice game. And now I don't want to get into the difference between playing a game and gambling and all the chance stuff. But Haman in the story of Esther was using dice or casting lots to determine the fate of the Jews. What was he doing, if you remember in the story? Evil Haman wanted to cast the dice to decide when the Jews would be exterminated. He determined which day, which just seemed random, right? Which month. So in the story, evil Haman cast the dice and it told him which month. And you remember it was the first month of the year when he was casting the dice, and the dice told him to exterminate the Jews on the 12th month. Seems random, but God's directing the dice. It seemed random that Haman cast the dice and it said that he needed to kill the Jews on the 14th day of Adar, the 12th month. This seems random, but it was all part of God's direction. And in this time and place in history, historians and archaeologists tell us that in the Middle East they used an interesting shaped dice, not the six-sided dice that we have, but it's a 4-sided dice. It looks like a pyramid. So there's an interesting correlation with that pyramid dice and some other things that come along in the story, but they still use these 4-sided dice over in the Middle East, and unfortunately sometimes that 4-sided dice is used in divination and evil things, not just games. But I want to point out, it seems random that evil Haman was tossing the dice to decide when to exterminate or kill the Jews. It seems random. Solomon, when he was writing the book of Proverbs, pointed out that even God is in control of what seems like a random event. In the book of Proverbs, Solomon said, "The lot is cast, but every decision is from the Lord." What's the point? It seems random, but God is still in control. It seems like a random decision, and evil Haman wasn't probably trying to get a decision from God when he was casting the dice. He was probably getting a decision from some evil spirit or doing divination or some other type of random, making a game out of when to kill Jews. But it seems random, but it wasn't, because those dice were decided. The dice pointed out it's going to be on this day and in this month, which, interestingly enough, in the whole story, show that there was time for God to make changes in that plan. What that man intended for evil, God intended for good. And the whole story got turned around. It seems random, but it's not. God's working behind the scenes. Another example I shared with you is Esther telling the Jews to hold a fast for 3 days before she went and approached the king. It seems random. She picked 3 days, and then 3 days later she went in and just was standing outside the court, and the king just happened to see her and happened to call her in and happened to give her grace because it was against the law to approach the king if you weren't called. I mean, there's all sorts of these. It just seems like random, but it's not random. It's God working behind the scenes. There's the night before evil Haman was going to approach the king and ask for permission to kill Mordecai the Jew. It's in Esther chapter 6. If you want to see it for yourself. Esther chapter 6 says, "On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring in the book of memorable deeds. Of all the nights for it to be noted that the king couldn't sleep was the night that evil Haman wanted to go and ask him if he could have permission to kill. And it just seems like what a coincidence. I mean, just the timing. What? How did all this come into play? But we know that God's controlling the timing. And sure enough, while the king is having the book read to him, it says the book tells him how Mordecai rescued him from an assassination attempt, and by chance the history readers just happened to grab the book of the good deed that had Mordecai in it. By chance the king couldn't sleep. In one translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, where it goes from Hebrew into Greek, there's actually one reference to the Lord in that one. The translators from Hebrew to Greek said, the Lord caused the king not to sleep. It's not in any of the Hebrew manuscripts, but the translators went, okay, there was obviously something happening here, because they saw all the things falling into place. They saw how the king couldn't sleep, the book of Chronicles was brought to him, they just randomly picked the book that had Mordecai in it. The king just randomly says, oh, Mordecai, we haven't done anything for him. And it just happens that Haman was right outside the palace when the king was trying to brainstorm on how to honor Mordecai. All these things just seem like random happenstance things, but we see that God is just working all the details and putting the pieces in the right place at the right time. Even after Esther tells the king that Haman is out to kill all the Jews, it says the king stormed out of the palace, and while he stormed out of the palace, Haman went to beg for his life, and either he trips and falls on the couch, or he's begging for mercy from the queen, and the king just happens to walk back in at the right time to see Haman on top of Esther begging for his life, and he misinterprets it and says, Haman, you're out of here. And he has him executed. I mean, it just seems like all random stuff, but it's not. The whole story of Esther is just God putting people in the right places at the right time, all the way up to the very end, where it seems like there is no time to change the edict that said all the Jews would be killed. Because what happens? Mordecai says, rewrite a new edict, tell all the Jews to defend themselves, and they sent it out by the king's fastest horses, and they got to all the towns ahead of time to share the news that the Jews should defend themselves from the edict that said all the Jews should be put to death and all of their stuff looted, and all of the Jews were saved. Just all pieced together. We see that God is in control of this whole story, but he's not mentioned in the story. Are they just falling into place? Are they just random? Or do we have a great God that's in control of the universe, even the casting of the dice? We have a great God, and we can trust him, and we can see that he's working behind the scenes even when we don't understand it, even when we don't see through the darkness. We can see that all things work together for his good, just like in Esther's story, where it seemed like she's growing up in a terrible time, in a bad situation, and there's death threats, and we can still trust that all things work together for God's good. It's for his story. One commentary is reading, worded this way, rather than despising our difficult circumstances, we can look for the opportunities that they might present to fulfill God's purposes. Whatever you face, if you ask for the courage to trust and obey God, his sovereignty will become apparent, and you'll be able to rejoice in his watch care over you. The commentary as I read this week reminded me of a story I heard years ago where it was explained sometimes when you're driving down the road and you get caught up in traffic, you're getting slowed up, you're hitting every red light. Maybe God's trying to slow you down for a reason. Maybe his hand of providence is saying, hey, calm down, slow down. I'm trying to save you from something up ahead. We don't know God's whole plan, and sometimes we go through these difficult times. We go through a struggle, and how could God ever be glorified through this? But God can still use, look at Esther's story, God can still use our difficult story to save and rescue others and change their story. We don't know. But the whole point of the story is, even though God's not mentioned in it, we can trust that he is still in control, and we can continue to trust him. One more history lesson in Esther's story here. As I point out, God's not in the story of Esther, but he is working through their story, working through these people, and his timing is very obvious. And some historians think that there might actually be a deliberate attempt to take God out of the story, which is kind of an interesting way. If you reread the story of Esther and think that somebody might have gone through and edited it and taken out references to God, references to praying, because back in this time in Persia, it might have been illegal There might have been laws against non-Persian religions or non-Persian gods, or non-Persian literature. So that there might have been somebody that had this historical writing of Esther's story and went, okay, all of these books are being burned and destroyed if it mentions any other god. So they might have gone through with a little whiteout or erased and erased. So tell the Jewish people to fast and pray. Well, we can't have pray, man. So it's almost like there's a deliberate attempt to remove references to God in it. But the point is, even with God removed, we know that God is still in control of the story. And this historical writing has still been preserved for us to have it, to show how God miraculously saved the Jews. Just like Mordecai said to Esther, God will provide a deliverer, whether it's through you or somebody else, God will deliver. And that's the point of the story. We can still trust, like Esther, that God is in control and he will send his deliverer. This story will still be told. One more story I want to tell you. Let's dig in a little bit deeper. Esther chapter 9. If you've got your copy of the scriptures, turn there. Esther chapter 9 is towards the end of the story of Esther. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days in which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that they had been turned from them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. Mordecai asked that the Jewish nation remember every year, year by year, on these days, Adar 13, 14, and 15, this miraculous story of how God saved the Jewish nation. Turned their story from sadness to joy, and they celebrate by sending gifts and giving food and helping the poor. But there's also a time of fasting. And I shared with you last week, this past Thursday, was the 13th of Adar, the day of fasting, before the Friday and Saturday, the 14th and 15th of Adar, to celebrate, to have the celebratory feast. I had an opportunity this week to go up to a Jewish community and walked into a Jewish deli. And as I was in there walking around and looking at some of the celebratory stuff for Purim, several of the folks walking in and out of this Jewish deli were greeting each other. Happy Purim, happy Purim, happy Purim. Remembering the story of Esther and Mordecai and how God delivered them, how God rescued them. And they had already celebrated. I was there on Thursday, so they were fasting, but they were getting ready for the feast and the celebration for Friday and Saturday. And one of the things that was kind of interesting, as they were saying Happy Purim, and getting ready for their celebration, I heard one of the fellows walking the road, is the Hamantash ready? And I was like, oh good, they've got some. And I told some of you about this. Part of the Jewish celebration is to have some Hamantash. It's a pastry. It's a tasty pastry that you have for dessert. It's part of Mordecai's declaration. You're going to have a day of fasting, then you have a day of celebration. And so the Jews have this little pastry that they make up called Hamantash, with a little, it's either got fruit in it or chocolate. And it's part of their celebration, and it's made in the form of a triangle. Where Michael and I were just talking about this the other day, because they're still not certain where this whole tradition came up in having Hamantash. It's a Hebrew word for Haman, the bad guy in the story. We booed at him last week. But the tash is the uncertain, they're uncertain on that, the Hebrew meaning of that. It could either mean Haman's covering, the Hamantash, his covering or his hat. And some speculate that Haman may have had a triangle-shaped hat. You should just like picture those, it was like the pirate hat, the triangle, or like a pyramid-shaped hat. Don't you wonder? Hamantash, his head was covered, his hat. Or Hamantash could mean Haman's pockets, because we know in the story of Esther, Haman wanted to have the Jews killed. He wanted all of their stuff taken, looted, and he was going to keep some of the Jewish possessions for himself and pass some of them on to the king. So Haman wanted to line his pockets, Hamantash. So the Jews might go, oh, well, Haman was trying to take from the Jews' possessions and take these to himself, but God turned the story around, and now the Jews get to keep their, and so it's part of the celebration, Hamantash. The third explanation says that Hamantash might be because of the dice that Haman cast. Because Pur is lots. And the Pur in Persian means he was casting lots, the Pur. And so when they named it Purim, it sounds like, hey, let's remember that Haman was casting lots for our destruction, but God was in control of the casting of the lots. Purim. It's a way of kind of a play on the words. Lot's day, or casting lots, or random day. But really, God was in control of the whole story, and God took what Haman was trying to do for evil and turned it into good. And like I said just a little bit ago, what did those dice look like? They were pyramid-shaped. They were triangle-shaped dice. And so if Purim is based on this triangle-shaped dice that they were using in their randomness of deciding when to slaughter the Jews and take their possessions, and instead God turned the whole story around and everything just randomly changed into God's story. Now we have these Hamantash. We have a triangle-shaped Jewish dessert to celebrate for Purim. All that to say, I was in the Jewish deli, and I heard somebody asking for some Hamantash, and I was like, I'm bringing some Hamantash to our church family. So I've got some Hamantash I'm going to share with you in just a little bit. We're going to wrap up the video part of the service, and then if you're here today, you get to celebrate some Hamantash. There's one other lesson I want to pull out of this, and it's in your Bible. It's in Genesis chapter 12. And if you have your copy of the scriptures, turn there really quickly. Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3. We have one more story we need to pull out of Esther's story here. Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." And Genesis 12:3 says, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse." King James says, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." There's one more story in the story of Esther, and it's this promise since the beginning of the book of Genesis, when God told Abraham, those who bless the Jews will be blessed, and those who dishonor or curse the Jews will be cursed. It's 2012 that this declaration from the Lord still stands. It was lived out in Esther's story, but it is still alive today. Those who bless the Jewish nation will be blessed, and those who will curse the Jewish nation will be cursed. As Christians, it's our responsibility to make sure the Jews are still hearing the truth. They were looking for the deliverer, and we know who the deliverer is. They were looking for somebody to come in and save, and Mordecai told Esther, you might be the deliverer, if not, the deliverer will come again. Well, we know that the deliverer came to rescue us and save us from our sin, and he's coming. We need to pass that truth on and that hope on to the Jews as well. We need to bless them and share with them how God is still sending the deliverer. Anyways, all this to say, the lessons from Esther are for Christians living in this pagan culture. God's timing to bring all of the key players in the scene at just the right moment is obvious. He puts Esther in this story, Mordecai in this story, and he puts you and me in his story to tell his story. But also, the reminder that Esther made an impact in her dark, crazy world. And we're supposed to be stars just like Esther, shining in a dark world. So church, as we close, just like Esther, God is here for this time and place in history. In your part of his story, for such a time as this, is all to be for his honor and for his glory. So just like Paul said, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, and shine like stars in the dark sky. With that being said, happy Purim, and God bless you and keep you.